off. It's good. I'm glad we do that for the kids. I really am. I think it's important that they have some stuff that's on their level, and so I think that's good. They're in here for us a couple of Sundays, and then they have something for them a couple of Sundays. So I think that's good that we're investing in our kids that way, and we're, kind of making a point of all of that. That's a positive step. It's Palm Sunday, they tell me. This is a time of the year when the church calendar, if you will, kind of comes to the forefront. We think about the Sunday before Easter, before Resurrection Sunday, and we tie it back to the biblical story when Jesus comes to Jerusalem for the final time. The Bible tells us more about his last week there in Jerusalem. We've got more details of that week than of any other time in his life. The 3-year ministry that he had, we get bits and pieces from it here and there, but we get a lot from that last week of his. Last week, we talked about hearing Jesus, and that was really focused on the things that God is doing to try and communicate with us and reach us and see things, help us to hear from him that way. This week, I want to think about seeing Jesus. All right. And again, I mentioned this final week. Part of what was going on as Jesus goes to Jerusalem was the Passover celebration, and it was an enormous event. It was a time of the year when they gathered to remember some national events, their exodus from Egypt, and it was a family time, and it was a spiritual time, and the Passover was a big event. I did a little bit of research trying to figure out how big the crowds were and stuff like that. So Jerusalem, the size of the city was actually kind of small. It's actually about the size of Newton. It's only about 6 or 8 miles square in either direction. They had roughly 80 to 100,000 people that lived in that town, right? So you can imagine if the entire population of Lauderdale County lived in Newton. Okay, that's about how crowded Jerusalem was on any given day. During these feasts, the Passover in particular, another maybe 100 to 200,000 people would show up, right? So imagine taking everybody who lives in Hinds County and bringing them over for the weekend. That's how busy and how crowded Jerusalem was during this final week leading up to Passover. They still celebrate Palm Sunday in a lot of places. This is a picture from the Philippines where a few 100,000 people gather for this Palm Sunday event. And to me, this picture just kind of showed the density of people that might have been there, right? So as Jesus comes into Jerusalem, there would have been crowds just shoulder to shoulder as he comes into the city. I want to take a minute and look at what happened the next day, though. On Monday. The day after Palm Sunday, on Monday, Jesus goes to the temple, and he clears out the temple again, and he's teaching in the temple. And then we pick it up in John chapter 12. There's an interaction that I find very intriguing. In John chapter 12, starting in verse 20, it says this, "Now, among those who went up to worship at the feast were some Greeks. These came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and asked him, 'Sir, we wish to see Jesus.'" Galilee, up in the north part of the country, was where Jesus was from, but it had a large foreign population. It had been a Greek colony at one time up around the lake there, and so these Greek folks come down to Jerusalem. They're part of what's going on there. They've heard about this Jesus character who made such a big entrance yesterday on Sunday. They've heard about what he did maybe in the temple. And so they go to a couple of his disciples. They go to Philip, who was from that same area, and they say, "We'd like to see Jesus." These guys aren't the first ones who've asked that question, though. One of the first ones that I could find in all of this was Herod. Herod wanted to see Jesus. Now this is not the Herod when Jesus was a baby. Okay, that was Herod the Great. This is his grandson who's named Herod. He's the Jewish ruler up in the north part of the country where Jesus is from. He's the guy who beheads John the Baptist a couple of years prior to this. And since that time, as Jesus has been preaching and teaching and performing miracles, Herod has wanted to meet him. He's wanted to see Jesus. And he finally gets his chance. In Luke chapter 23, Jesus has been arrested. He gets arrested Thursday night, that final week. He gets arrested Thursday night. Friday morning, he's brought before the Roman ruler, Pilate. And Pilate hears the charges against him, says, I really don't see anything going on here. And the Jews keep pressing. And they tell how Jesus has been all up in Galilee causing all kinds of trouble. And Pilate goes, wait, where'd you say he was from? Galilee. Herod's from Galilee. That's who needs to be hearing about Jesus. So Pilate ships him over across town to Herod. Herod's there for the feast as well. And so Herod gets to finally see Jesus. In verse 6 it says this, verse 7. When he learned that Jesus belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over there. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad. He'd long desired to see him because he'd heard about him, and he was hoping to see some sign done by him. He wanted to see Jesus perform a miracle, put on a show, do a little song and dance maybe. He wanted the spectacle. And so he questions him, he cajoles him, he mocks him, and Jesus doesn't say a word. As far as I can tell, this is the only person in the Bible that Jesus never, ever speaks to or acknowledges. Herod. He wanted to see Jesus, but it was all about the entertainment. It was all about what Jesus could bring to him, about what he could get out of that. Zacchaeus earlier had wanted to see Jesus. Leading up to the final week, prior to that, Jesus had passed through the town of Jericho, which is over on the east side of the country. And as he's going through Jericho, you know the story, right? Out of Luke 19. As he's going through there, it says, there was a man named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector. He was rich. He was seeking to see who Jesus was. But on account of the crowd, he could not because he was small in stature. I had a professor in Bible college who swore that this verse meant that Jesus was the short guy. He said, if you look at the way it's constructed, it's Jesus is the short guy. I said, I don't know about that. It probably didn't hurt anything that the professor was only about yay tall. He was kind of wanting that as sort of a biblical precedent. In a way, we've kind of turned Zacchaeus into a kid's story, haven't we? Wee little man, and wee little man was he. He climbs up in the tree because he wants to see Jesus. The Bible doesn't present Zacchaeus that way. This is a chief tax collector, so he's got an official position. He holds a lot of influence in terms of what he can get accomplished. He's a rich man, so he's got some dignity, he's got some gravitas about him. But he wants to see Jesus, and he runs on ahead, and he climbs up into the tree. And as Jesus is passing by, he calls down to him. I'm going to your house today. And so Zacchaeus has this encounter with Jesus. And it sets him on a new course. It sets him on a new direction. He gives, back things that he's taken in his position, where he's abused the power that he has. He gives some of that back, and Jesus acknowledges him as a son of Abraham. This was someone who wanted to see Jesus, and he had this encounter with him. But let's think back to our Greeks for just a minute. Let's go back to John chapter 12. So the Greeks have come to Philip. Philip, pick it up between two, he goes and tells Andrew. And then the two of them go to Jesus. Hey, there's some Greeks. They want to meet you. And Jesus says, The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. And I've got to imagine here, Philip and Andrew saying, hey, there's some guys that like to meet you. And Jesus starts talking about grains of wheat and death, and they're going, there's some guys that want to meet you. There's kind of this disconnect between the question and the answer, which is one of the things that Jesus does a lot. I take a little bit of comfort in that, because a lot of times I misunderstand what somebody's asking, and I'll give an answer like this, and they're asking me something like that. And I just kind of play it off as like a Jesus moment or something. So Jesus gives them this answer about his time. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. This is actually really, really significant, because all throughout his last 3 years of ministry, he's been telling people, the hour hasn't come, the hour hasn't come, thy time has not come, thy time has not come, over and over and over. We read that. He tells his mom that, he tells his disciples that, he tells people in Samaria that. The time has not come. Now, we're into his final week. And he says, the hour has come. And he starts talking about grain that has to fall to the earth, that has to die. The wheat plant produces the seeds up on top of it, and the wheat plant dies and the seeds are left. If the wheat plant keeps on living, the seeds never ripen, they never fall to the earth, and it never reproduces. And in the midst of that conversation, a few verses later, drop down to 32 and 33, Jesus is talking to him again about all this that's going to take place. And there's this voice out of heaven, and the crowds hear it and stuff. And he talks about what that was for their benefit. And then in 32, he says, now is the judgment of this world. And now will the ruler of this world be cast out. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. And he said this to show by what kind of death he was going to die. Jesus, when he's talking about wheat, he's not talking about farming. He's talking about what's going to take place in just a few days on Friday morning on the cross. When I am lifted up, I will draw all people to myself. Jesus' answer to Philip and Andrew, hey, there's some Greeks that want to meet you. There's some Greeks that would like to see you. His answer to them is essentially, wait a few days. I'll be available Friday morning. They can see me then. If we want to see Jesus, we have to look to the cross. Seeing Jesus is not about entertainment. It's not about the warm, fuzzy feelings we get. It's not about all of that can turn into sometimes where things just become all about the value that we feel like we're getting out of it. It's not that. Seeing Jesus is more than just some kind of a passing encounter where we have an interaction with him and then we put it away and we do our stuff during the week and then we come back on Sunday, we have another encounter with him. Seeing Jesus is more than that. Seeing Jesus is seeing and understanding the cross. That's the answer that Jesus gives to these Greeks. He showed them who he was on the cross. The hour had come, the time had come for him to be glorified, and it took place by flipping the script on its head through his death. He was lifted up, not in the sense of the accomplishments that he had or the praise of the people, but he was lifted up on an instrument of Roman torture. To see Jesus, we have to see the cross. We come to Jesus on his terms when we see him on the cross. We see his compassion on display. He didn't have to go. He wasn't the one who had sinned. He wasn't the one who was guilty. That was you and I. We see his mercy, where he takes that penalty away from us. We see his grace, where he offers us Himself. He offers us forgiveness in His name. And yeah, I'm going to give the Sunday school answer. We see His love. It sounds overused, but the fact of the matter is it's true. Not a love in the sense of, that kind of emotional sense, but the self-sacrifice and the self-giving, the type of love that just keeps on and on and on and on. If we want to see Jesus, we have to see Him as He is. The Son of God, existent throughout eternity, instrumental in creating the world, yes, but one that loved us enough to come down to earth, to live a perfect and sinless life, and yet take on Himself our sins on the cross. Love on display. I'm going to offer a time of invitation. If you need to see Jesus, we can arrange for that. We can answer questions. We can talk about things. If you need to come to Jesus in faith, if you need to come to Jesus in repentance, we can help with that. So as the worship team makes their way up, we'd invite you, if you have a decision you need to make, to do so now.